Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Paul. I'm Deputy Head of the Europe in the World Programme here at the EPC. On behalf of the EPC, I'm very pleased and delighted to invite you to our discussion today on EU-Mongolia relations. This is a really important discussion. And you don't often have that many discussions on Mongolia in Brussels, so I think that's a mistake. But I think the fact that we're having this discussion underlines the EU's growing interest in deepening ties with Mongolia, a key democratic partner committed to maintaining its independence and openness and enhancing its role in the global economy despite the geographical constraints and geopolitical challenges. When God was designing the world, he put you in a tight spot between some big powers. Now this dialogue is, I would say, it's not a starting point, but it's quite a starting point of the EPC's intention to do further work, not only on Mongolia, but also on Central Asia. It's not that Central Asia isn't a region that we've done that much work on, but it's our intention to do much more. I run our program related to the wider Black Sea region, so it goes up to like Azerbaijan. So we want to expand further to the, to the east and up. So I can't think of a better country to start with than Mongolia. And my colleague who's sitting here today, Raúl, he has written a policy brief on Mongolia-EU relations. You can access it by scanning the QR code. That's what we have to do nowadays. We're no longer allowed to print anything out. So please do look at it. It's a really excellent piece of work. And I think with a strong willingness from both sides and a concrete roadmap in place, there is significant potential to expand Mongolia's involvement in the EU's connectivity and global partnership initiatives, as well as the EU support for Mongolia's economic diversification and autonomy. It's really a big pleasure to be joined today by Mongolia's ambassador to Belgium, His Excellency Bold Luvsanvandan, and I hope I pronounced that well. Welcome to you. He's also the ambassador in the Netherlands and Luxembourg, as well as Belgium. So you have a big portfolio, sir. And we're going to discuss this roadmap and the main challenges and opportunities ahead. We're also glad to be joined by a really exceptional group of experts on the region who Raúl will present in a moment. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm looking forward to learning much more about Mongolia and about areas where the EU can strengthen dialogue or have more cooperation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Raúl to introduce the other speakers and kick off this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you especially for being here, His Excellency. It's great that you're here for the first time at the EPC on this occasion. Before introducing the panel and informing you on the housekeeping rules for the occasion, I would like to give the floor to the ambassador for some opening remarks, which I think will set up the stage much better than I could ever do. So the floor is yours, Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, once again, good afternoon. It is a great honor and privilege for me to be here today at the European Policy Center. It's my first time here. And having this dialogue, which is a very sound name, like bridging gaps in the EU connectivity strategy, case for stronger EU and Mongolia ties. So that's really like a very important topic for us. And of course, first and foremost, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the European Policy Center for organizing this dialogue and for inviting us to share our thoughts on the topic that has a real significant importance for both Mongolia and the European Union. Since early 90s, Mongolia has made tremendous strides in its political and economic transformation. Our journey to becoming, like you mentioned, constitutional, pluralistic and democratic state with an open market economy has been challenging yet rewarding. In navigating this path, Mongolia has always valued the support and partnership of the European Union and its member states. Our third neighbor policy has been instrumental in helping us build strong relationships with countries beyond our immediate geographical neighbors. The European Union has been a key partner in this regard, supporting Mongolia's efforts to diversify its economy and attract investment in various sectors beyond our traditional reliance on mining. Today's dialogue comes in a critical juncture. As Mongolia seeks to further integrate into the global economy, the EU's global connectivity initiatives present a unique opportunity for deeper collaboration. By enhancing our connectivity, we can bolster Mongolia's economic diversification and create more resilient and stable supply chains that benefit both our regions. The EU's support through the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement and other important instruments has laid a strong foundation for our cooperation. However, there is much more we can achieve together. This dialogue is an excellent platform for experts from both sides to access our current relations and explore new avenues for partnership. I am confident that our discussions today will be fruitful and will pave the way for a stronger, more strategic partnership between the EU and Mongolia. Let us work together to bridge the gaps and build the future that is mutually beneficial for our people and our economies. Thank you once again for this opportunity, and I look forward to the insightful discussions ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And as you mentioned, this is a critical juncture, also at the institutional level for both our regions. We are transitioning into a new cycle in the European Union, and there are elections happening in Mongolia around the corner for the next Great Chorale. So this is a very timely moment to discuss and to take a stock of where the partnership stands and what are the ways and the concrete steps to make it into a deeper and more strategic one. We will discuss a number of issues, and I will be very happy to hear from the participants, not just from the speakers, but to name a few. I think we can talk on the positive feedback loops that Mongolia and the EU can build on connectivity, on economic diversification, the green and digital transitions, and also issues such as rule of law and pluralism, in which Mongolia has been truly a pioneer in the region and a like-minded partner for the European Union. To discuss these issues, we're very fortunate to have an excellent lineup, which I will shortly introduce. Professor Uradyn Bulag, who is a professor and research director at the Mongolian and Inner Asia Studies Unit at the University of Cambridge. We have with us as well Jean-Louis Ville from DG INPA, Directorate-General for International Partnerships. He's the head of unit for the East Asia and Pacific unit. And last but not least, Olena Borodyna from ODI England, and she's a senior geopolitical transitions risks advisor. And special thanks to Olena and to Uradyn for taking the Eurostar this morning for being with us here today. So I will ask a series of introductory questions to each of the speakers, after which I will slowly open up the discussion for the broader audience. Perhaps, if I may start with you, Professor Bulag, building on the remarks by the ambassador, you could perhaps contextualize a bit more how it is, in fact, that Mongolia has managed to stay autonomous and independent, despite being at the crossroads of two very powerful powers such as China and Russia, how Mongolia has navigated these circumstances and remained an autonomous and liberal democracy, and what role the European Union has played in this process, and how do you see things going ahead?
Thank you.
Maybe we can push that.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'm not a policy analyst. I haven't been to many occasions as such. So my talk is going to be quite academic, and I don't really have any vocabulary for policy making. So bear with me. Now, I also saw that you would want me to sort of make a 5 minutes opening speech. But anyway, all right. So how do I start explaining the reason why Mongolia has been successful in maintaining its independence as well as maintaining a kind of democratic value, right? And this is really a miracle. I mean, if you look at the whole thing, Mongolia is now characterized as a beacon of democracy, or sometimes it is called cradle of democracy, right? Now, if you look at it, Mongolia from this perspective, it is actually geographical as well as ideological, right? Which means that it is surrounded by darkness, right? Or surrounded by desert. In other words, Mongolia is, from this perspective, is situated in a precarious sort of geographical, location, right? Now that is interesting in a sense that it is you somehow characterize Mongolia in a grave danger if you take this perspective, right? And then of course, if you take this perspective, then you really want to sort of help Mongolia. Mongolia is losing out to, or being threatened by China, by Russia, right? Especially today. But the of course the reality is of course a miracle that Mongolia has been, well, I mean, independent, right? At the same time, it managed to maintain a vibrant democracy. So how do we actually explain the miracle, right? That's something that we should all think about. Now, of course, it would take hours to sort of give a historical explanation for the success of Mongolia to maintain these two things. But I would say, briefly, that Mongolia, it all depends on Mongolian wisdom. In Mongolia, we call it Mongol Han, right? Now, what is Mongolian wisdom? Mongolian wisdom actually, I believe, it goes back to the imperial time when Mongolia called itself great state, Ikhodos, right, rather than an empire or whatever, which means that Mongolia at that time, back in the 13th century, 14th century, needed to align itself with different groups, right? And it need to manage a number of different groups in its large state or in large state. And Mongolia didn't really sort of endorse or adopt an ideological position as Chinese or as some others who maintain a civilizational discourse, right? So they would regard themselves as civilized versus these barbarian, whereas Mongolians actually treated people relationally. So let me give you an example. In the Chinese case, they would call themselves civilized, and the other would be called barbarian, and those people would need to be civilized, right? It depends on where you are in these in relation to the capital city, right? But in Mongolia, during the Mongol Empire, especially in the eastern part of the empire, Mongols actually classified the population into different groups, right? And of course, in a hierarchical order. So that means that the Mongolians were adapt to this sort of relational sovereignty rather than sort of oppositional sort of sovereignty or discourse. So that really, this wisdom helped Mongolia to gain independence in 1911, where Mongolia defined its relation with the Manchu or Qing Empire in relational terms as an ally who betrayed Mongolia. Therefore, Mongolia needed to get independent, but not really treating the to mention as an enemy, but saying thank you very much for alliance. We've been good friends for 200 years. Now you betrayed us because you align your interests with the Chinese. Then, therefore, thank you very much. Good luck. And we want to be part of, another union, or alliance with Russia. So sort of the Mongols, the pursuit of independence or sovereignty really is simultaneously a pursuit of alliance or dependency on another group, that's the Russians, right? So the moment Mongolia became independent, Mongolia also became dependent on Russia, right? And thanks to that wisdom, I would call it wisdom, and some people say it's probably too silly to do that, but I would call it wisdom because of that, or thanks to that, Mongolia has been independent since then, since 1911. Of course, in between there, other things that happened, but by and large, I think Mongols were helpful. The whole, mechanism was helpful in helping Mongolia to maintain its independence. Now, in terms of ideology, in terms of democracy, I would call it a way of life. It's not an ideology from Mongolian perspective. It's a new way of life. When you treat it as a way of life, it is not ideological, right? In other words, Mongolia would not need to take an oppositional position, somehow treating itself as the best in the world and the other, the two neighboring countries as barbaric or authoritarian regimes, therefore put yourself in opposition to your neighbors. Mongolia has never taken that position. And that's, I think, the functioning of Mongolian wisdom, and which means that Mongolia has been able to maintain its value as a democracy, as a credible democracy in that, that dangerous, geography, right, squeezed and landlocked between two large powers, right, who do not really, share Mongolia's values. And yet Mongolia has been able to survive. Now the question is today, and from the, and especially in light of this new development, Russia-Ukraine war, right? And when the question is really whether Europe needs how to approach Mongolia. Should the EU approach Mongolia as a frontline democracy, or EU should really treat Mongolia as a way of life, maintaining a way of life, and maintaining that way of life, a democratic way of life, right? Sharing the same value with the EU would actually be beneficial to both Mongolia and EU. Because after all, whatever we do from this end, right? Whatever value we actually hold, we need to make sure that Mongolia survive in the first place. And the bad news, of course, today is, the two neighbors are really, moving into Mongolia and putting Mongolia in a very difficult situation. And I very much hope that Mongolian leaders, right, from both, different political persuasions, would be wise enough and pray to our ancestral wisdom and then maintain, this position. Therefore, right, I think that's my. Well,
thank you very much. You mentioned at the beginning that you were not going to give a policy analyst typical contribution, but I think that's incredibly valuable. It's very important to go back into the historical roots and see the patterns repeating. And speaking of patterns that repeat, I think this wisdom that you described so eloquently is picked up in some of Mongolia's contemporary foreign policy, namely the Third Neighbour Policy. And if I may now turn to Mr. Ville from the Commission, how would you assess the role that the European Union has played as a third neighbor to Mongolia, especially since 2017 with the signing of the cooperation framework, and in relation to all of the numerous initiatives that have slowly coalesced in EU-Mongolia relations, Global Gateway, Mongolia's 2050 vision that the European Union is actively trying to support, and of course the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raúl, and apologies for keep you waiting, but you see the white building on the back seems to be the center of activities, and it was a bit difficult to cross the road to come here. For those who don't know, apparently this is the back of the EPP building. I don't know whether you heard about EPP recently, but it seems to have some talks there. So let's go back to Mongolia, which is a much more interesting subject for today. Well, first of all, I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, couple of points, I don't pretend. Mongolia is certainly a valued democratic partner, and it's rather, I'd say, don't quote me, an exception in the region. If you look beyond the two neighbors, I mean, Asia at large, it's not that you have that many countries that have such a, let's say, democratic system or performing democratic system. Now, there's no judgment, as Professor Bulag said. I mean, we don't want to get into ideology. I'm just stating facts. The system, the political system in Mongolia is of democratic nature, and it's working. So this is it. And also, Mongolia is quite exceptional in some of the position it has taken regarding, let's say, global human rights and issues and let's say governance issues. I've been working on human rights issues. I used to be the head of unit for human rights in INPA, and Mongolia was quite striking as a different or a special country in Asia. Why? Because it's the only country that has actually abolished death penalty in the region, which makes it completely different to many others. And I'm here again, I'm not talking about ideology, or I mean, if you look at, there are extremely high income countries, developed countries with very much democratic oriented countries. I will not make names, not to put anyone at odd, which still have a death penalty in their penal code. So it makes it different from that perspective. Now, the third policy, the Third Neighbour Policy, as it was described, is certainly a lot of wisdom. It's a very difficult path to walk because of the size of the two neighbors, because Mongolia is a completely landlocked country. So you have no other way. I mean, the only way you more or less can come out of the country freely is through air. So it gives you immediately the sense of how it goes. Whenever you go north, south, east, or west, you have to come across one of your neighbors, meaning you have to be in good relation with both. Otherwise, you immediately will face a problem. And we've seen that in the recent years when Mongolia was trying to say move carefully through the path, the reaction and the petitioning of both neighbors. I mean, it was said that, I mean, of course, both now are trying to push or to pull, depending on how you see it, Mongolia on one or another side. And one should keep in mind, I mean, it was not said, probably somebody will come into this. I mean, Mongolia is extremely dependent on its two neighbors. It's not a matter of choice. We can be on our own because we are certainly rich enough, etc. But I mean, there are still extremely important economic links, be it on raw materials. I mean, if you look at two small, I mean, not small, two important things, coal on one end that goes into China and gas on the other that comes from Russia. So it sounds odd, but I mean, this is how it is. They are both energy related, but still Mongolia is exporting a lot of coal to China and importing a lot of gas for its energy mix. Meaning it's when you have such a dependence situation in a country, puts yourself in a, I wouldn't say weak position, but you need to be very careful with your relations. Now, this being said, in this context, the EU is considered as a strategic partner by Mongolia, and in all its efforts to diversify its economy. I've spoken about raw material. I mean, raw materials will come to that, but I mean, let's say mineral that are the bulk and the suckle of the economy, and of course its dependency from both countries I've explained. Now, if we look at Mongolia as well, I mean, I've had the chance to go once. When you go there, you do immediately understand that the country is affected and visibly affected by climate change. So if we look at global challenges and putting big figures or big spots on the map, climate change is definitely one thing that is affecting Mongolia. Now, I'm in charge of the Pacific, so it's a completely different world as well, where you have a lot of water and sea level rises. Here, you don't have that problem. But I mean, desertification is clearly, afforestation is clearly the other. And it's both are consequences of climate change. So different consequences, but the same causes, I'd say, that makes, in our view, Mongolia a country that needs to be supported in its transition, not only in its energy transition, but it needs to be supported in the process of getting resilient to climate change. Now, of course, economic dependence, meaning trying to look into economic diversifications. It's good that there is a lot of coal and minerals in Mongolia, but of course the country has been very reliant and dependent on this. And in the past, it has also driven to certain crises when world market prices of these commodities have went probably down, and that has put Mongolia as adult from a macroeconomic point of view. So meaning you definitely need to find other sources of revenues to allow yourself to maintain and sustain the way you run the country, because otherwise, well, and then budgets and the budgetary and the financial aspects will suffer. So what we try to do, in the sense that trying to make Mongolia less dependent on all sort of heterogeneous or exogenous shocks, let's say, is to focus. We do try to focus on two things, mainly the big ideas. One is the green sustainable development, which would tackle both, let's say, sustainable and green development, meaning taking into account the climate change dimension of the development. And the other element, which is very enshrined in the country, which is the democratic and economic development as well. So both are the two axes of what we want to do. It looks broad, but it is on what we try to focus on. Now, the approach we take, and probably most of you have already heard it so many times that I'm really hesitant to come into it, but I have to say it is our global gateway strategy, which is the offer we make to Mongolia as a country, as many others, in order to accelerate their green and digital transition, and also to meet their infrastructure needs on one hand. Of course, the strategy combines, as you probably all know, hard infrastructures and soft elements in enabling environment, because I mean, global gateway is about money, but it's not only about money. It's not only about public money. We are poor if we look at the investments and the capacity, financial capacity that we have as a union. Of course, we try to team up with our member states. That makes a bit more. We team up with our banks, EIB, and the development banks of the various countries, AFD, KfW, CDP, etc. EIB, sorry, should have started with that one. But it's still small. So the next partner, which is the obvious one in development, is the private sector, meaning we have to bundle and come with packages and offers, or using at best the tools and the capacity, financial capacity we have to attract investment from the private sector. So, of course, it's about hard infrastructures, and I mean we have a few examples of that of what we've done in support to this, but also it's about the regulatory frameworks, the norms and standards applicable, so that private sector feels comfortable to come into the country and invest in the country, both in the numerous sectors, of course, but not only. That probably is the way that needs to be pushed forward. Please stop me because I can talk for hours, So how do we try to translate that? As I said, we team up with our member states and our banks in Team Europe initiatives, and which are big projects where everyone of this group try to step in with an element that at the end has a higher benefit. 1 + 1 is not equal 2. In that case, we try to make it equal 3, if not more. Now we have framed that into a Team Europe initiative, which is called the Green Economic Growth, so climate-related economic development, where we have a couple of member states, Czech Republic, Germany, France, and many banks for once, so EBRD, EIB, KfW, GIZ. AfD is not present to my best knowledge, but they might not be far away. And we try to invest in agriculture, forests, and renewable energy sectors. It matches well with energy development, independence, and let's say the resilience to climate change. I should say here that, Mongolia is one of the 4 countries on the world that has signed with the EU a forest partnership. I have the chance to have another one, which is called PNG, which is completely different climate and different size. The others are in Africa. But it makes it special from that perspective, and it matches very well with the president's view to have this 1 billion tree initiative that he launched, and we were looking into that still. It's quite long and complex to put in place, especially in the climate conditions of the country. You totally understand that it's not exactly the same as a tropical forest in PNG or in RD and DRC. So we need to work on it and see how we will implement it. But clearly, we perceive Mongolia as an important partner on forestry because it is a country where that definitely makes a lot of sense to become a country resilient to climate change. Now, on one hand. On the other hand, I already touched upon it quite a lot. If we want to mobilize, if we want to diversify and mobilize investment in a country, we definitely need to have a conducive environment for both the public and the private sector to work. And that includes fights against corruption, transparency, predictable policy and regulatory frameworks, and fair treatment of foreign investors. And here, perhaps, and then, again, don't see what I say as a criticism. I think there's work to be done because the recent changes and the recent moves in the legislative side of the environment, the business environment in Mongolia is perhaps driving the investor, or might push the investors into an hesitation phase or some concern about what will happen if I come to the country and I'm not going to come for, let's say, 6 months or a year. The investments that I might do in a country will be on the longer term if there is a possibility. Now, don't see that as a criticism. I perfectly understand the balance that the country wants to keep between controlling and keeping hands on its own natural resources. This is absolutely clear. This is valid for Mongolia as many other countries in the world. But it's a difficult trade-off to make to keep control, let's put it this way, I'm simplistic, and not discourage investors to come for whatever reasons. And of course, there is a lot of discussion needs to be done, and explanation, and let's say translation, not in a literal sense of it, but explaining what and how things are going to happen, or what is in mind of the authorities for the legislation that is in place, so that everyone understands and can put a risk, because at the end of the day, this is what we're talking about. It's about risk. You have a geopolitical risk that we've heard about. Of course, from a business perspective, you have also an investment risk, and this is what drives, at the end of the day, the decision, yes or no, to go into a discussion or an investment. Now, if we look at another matter of concern in terms of policy, so the renewable policy, renewable energy policy, and the discussions it's ongoing on green energy transition in Mongolia, where, again, not a criticism of, and it's not the only country that has some difficulties in setting up a kind of perspectives in terms of green transition. I think the people just in the building next door might also discuss the same sort of issues with the European Union. Because, I mean, we need to set a perspective, a timeline, and a way forward, a path. And then on that basis, others will make their own decision. And this is also what the Mongolian government needs to do, and try to stabilize a bit the perspective, the goals that they want to achieve before, and then explain it. So here, perhaps things needs to be clarified. I'm no one to say it should be like this or like that. That's not the point. But yeah, directions is certainly necessary. Now, last point, and I'll stop. Critical raw material as well is a very interesting subject. Everyone is after all these rare earth and other materials that are necessary for the clean tech transition. Mongolia is certainly one of the countries in the world that has wealth of that sort of minerals on its territory, and of course it's a very challenged and look after kind of things by all, the European Union, but not only. I mean, the US, Korea, China, Russia, and it's a very long list. So I will not go into this. I would certainly forget somebody. So that's not the point. But it makes here again challenging signing on a call or an agreement to say we're going to work in the field of critical raw material is fine. But then you need money, then you need companies, then you need engineers, capital to invest in the country to exploit. And then how do you ensure that these materials, when they are been extracted, probably transformed in the country, are taken out are exported to whatever destination when you are in the position you are geographically in, as Mongolia is. So this is certainly a question to which I don't have an answer, but I mean, this naturally comes to your mind when you're discussing these very sensitive issues. I think I'll stop here because I've already.
Thank you. Brilliant overview. Thank you very much. Lots to unpack. And as you mentioned at the beginning of your exposition, there are some structural issues that have been going on for the past maybe 20 years or more in macroeconomic terms in Mongolia, namely overdependence on Chinese markets for their mineral exports and overdependence on Russian energy imports, plus an energy mix that could be more diversified. I think these circumstances existed before 2022, but certainly in a post-Russian invasion of Ukraine world, in a more multipolar and contested world, these balancing acts have probably become all the more difficult, especially coupled to the geo-economic rush for critical raw materials and supply chains. So now if I may turn to Mrs. Borodyna to unravel this very, very challenging nexus between the geoeconomics and the geopolitics of it. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Raúl. And I'll keep my remarks brief because I think my fellow panelists have already touched upon some of the issues that I was going to touch on, and I want to leave space for discussion. But I think it's fair to say that in the last couple of years, we've seen a big push both from Mongolia, but also from external partners to engage the country. The US, various European countries, Germany, France have all been looking to Mongolia to tap into the resources of copper, uranium, rare earth minerals, you name it. Mongolia has quite a lot of material, so we're not going to go through the whole chemical table. And there has been a similar push as with Mongolia, there's been a similar push in Central Asia from the EU, from the US to engage countries like Kazakhstan, given the geopolitical volatility in the region in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're also seeing this big push on what's now called the Middle Corridor, some of the transport links that have existed but are now but the EU is now looking to engage Central Asian countries to facilitate those trade connections and make them more efficient. And for countries like Mongolia, this is a big opportunity to tap into their resources for development. And there's been the recent announcement of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which I think is one of those developments that might concern some of the foreign investors going into the country because of previous concerns around how that money is going to be spent and what that means for the investment environment. And we have seen some agreements and deals take place. So France, I think, is looking to tap into the uranium reserves and to do geosurveying because, of course, wanting to develop critical minerals is quite a broad goal. You need very practical things to make it happen. You need to understand where the minerals are located, whether it's commercially viable to extract them, how much it's going to cost, do you have the right infrastructure to take the minerals from A to B, and do you have the right relationship in the region to do that? Because, of course, to get from A to B, you need railways, which might have to go through Russia or China, and they have to. How many of those deals will materialize and go through, I think, remains to be seen, because those will have to become commercially viable projects. But I think my bigger concern / question would be to what extent we continue this big push on economic and diplomatic engagement, both with Mongolia, but also with Central Asia more broadly, because the reality is that diversifying those supply chains is going to take long-term commitment, is going to take a lot of capital, and whether we have the appetite to do that, I don't quite know. And if we're not prepared to nurture those relationships and to commit to them, then China and Russia are probably going to step in. Because from China's point of view, as Professor Bulag has outlined, China has a long history with Mongolia, and it sees Mongolia as part of its periphery. And China has prioritized periphery diplomacy with Central Asia and with Mongolia for a long time, and it has sustained those relationships for decades, whereas our engagement goes up and down depending on where we are on our priority list. So for China, for example, the corridor with Mongolia and Russia, the Central Asia corridor, CPEC are all strategically important, both in the case of Taiwan contingency, but also to keep the supply chains to Europe open, whether we have, but also because of Inner Mongolia and its resources in wind and solar and rare earth as well. So China is going to be there, and China is going to engage with Mongolia. Whether we will sustain those relationships, I don't quite know. And I'll leave that here because I'm sure we'll have lots of follow-up questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think perhaps to give you some minutes to think of questions, I can ask a couple more follow-up questions, general ones for the whole panel, if they can answer very briefly. And meanwhile, feel free to start coming up with questions for the Q&A. So as you mentioned, there is a lot of perhaps untapped potential in connectivity initiatives in Central Asia that Mongolia has so far been left out of. That would be my assessment. I'm happy to hear disagreement on it, but the geographical and political constraints are what they are. And now the question is, are these constraints absolute, or what can the European Union do to help Mongolia overcome them? And this is a question that I pose to the panelists. So happy to hear whoever wants to come in first.
I think that's a very important question. I think over the last 40 years, Mongolia has made some real catastrophic mistakes in terms of its regional policy or lack of regional development policy. Mongolia has, since 19 90 liberalized its, movement of population for, herders from all over Mongolia moved to the central part of Mongolia, basically settled around Ulaanbaatar or into Ulaanbaatar South. So now, we have really a dramatically and absurd sort of imbalance of a population. And we have possibly, I don't know, about 2/3 of the population concentrated in a couple of cities. And throughout the countryside, you got only 300,000 herders, right? Okay. Now, which means that Mongolia is really sort of concentrated in everything, right? In one particular place, that is Ulaanbaatar city, and which is linked to China and to Russia by one railway link, right? Now, throughout the countryside, there is no infrastructure, nothing whatsoever these days, because those infrastructure used to be there, but has been destroyed by successive governments, by neglecting them, right? Allowing those infrastructure to be abandoned or to rotten, right? And I just don't quite understand, the successive governments, whether they are, democratic, governments or People's Party government or whatever government they have, for the last 30 years, they have adopted this very silly policy, I think. Now, which means that, they abandoned the countryside, especially the western part of Mongolia. I traveled I think, several provinces of Western Mongolia last July, and it's really empty. And it's horrifyingly empty. It's really weird. And so anybody who's been to Mongolia will know, right, the capital city is crowded, so crowded, overcrowded, whereas countryside is really empty. And this is not good for Mongolia's sovereignty, right? Now, what I'm trying to suggest is that any development or any investment into the existing infrastructure in Mongolia, which is basically concentrated in Ulaanbaatar or along the roadway, would actually deepen the dependency on Russia and China, right? And that actually goes against our wish, that is to lessen their independence on China and Russia, right? So what is alternative? The alternative is, I hope EU would really help Mongolia to adopt a regional development policy, right? Focus on the countryside by investing in the provincial capitals, and especially in the western part, which is empty of people, right? Now, there are two. The question is, of course, how do we do this, right? And why do we do this, right? Well, why do we do this? Well, we have. I just said that it's important to develop the countryside. Secondly, it's actually the Western Mongolia is actually, it's very close to the country, to Central Asia. It's only 50 kilometers away from Central Asia, right? Right. Which means that if you develop the region well, you might be able to open up a larger space for yourself. In other words, you're going to have access to a cluster of what I would call forced neighbors. Forced neighbors. Today, Mongolia has 3 neighbors, right? 2 equal neighbors, territorial neighbors, and then we have a non-territorial or non-contiguous third neighbors, cluster of third neighbors, democracies, right? But those democracies are so far away, right? They wouldn't be able to help Mongolia in a substantial way. If anything happens, let's say, China moves in, Russia moves in with tanks, would any country from here physically go there to help? I doubt it, right? Then I also understand, but I'm not a EU specialist, but understand that EU also want to have a larger space, want to enlarge space, right? Through Central Asia, because it's really important to have a larger space for survival, right? So what I'm trying to, I'm confused here, but what I'm trying to say is that through the Fourth Neighbour Policy, I mean, if there's going to be a Fourth Neighbour Policy, Mongolia would need to sort of redirect its resources, and the EU would perhaps, reorient its own policy, right, towards that end. And once we sort of reach a consensus, then something, new might emerge, and one never knows. But still, this is a proposal. Now, there's another thing I want to mention, that is, I think, Mr. Ville, you mentioned a number of EU countries involved in helping Mongolia, right? You got France, you got Czech, you got how many countries? You got Poland, you got Hungary, Italy, Bulgaria, right? And Germany, 7 countries. Now, who are those countries? These countries. The majority of these countries actually were involved in helping Mongolia back in the social period, right? During the Comintern period, right? So at that time, we have East Germany, we have Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Poland, 6 countries. Right? They formed partnership with many institutions in Mongolia, and they were very effective in supporting Mongolia economy. And indeed, most of Mongolia's light industries were developed by these Eastern European or Central European countries. And a Mongolian, I think you would agree with me, most Mongolians today actually look to that period, look to those countries with nostalgia. They're really grateful for those countries. And that story needs to be told to both sides, to the Mongolians, remind them, and also to EU members, right, that you have a tradition of helping, and the Mongolians have never forgotten that. And what's more important is that those countries and the project they supported were actually meant to, and indeed help Mongolia to lessen the dependence on the Soviet Union and China, right? And more importantly, many of those industries still alive and kicking. For example, the meat factory built by East Germany is still alive, right? And Czechoslovakia opened its mine, which of course taken over by the Soviet Union in 1971, right? But it's still, we have to, acknowledge Czech contribution and so on and so forth, right? So I would suggest, actually, instead of, developing, I don't know, going into a number of, sectors, and I don't know how you divide it up, but I would encourage you to develop partnership with regional administrations, right? Administrations, and develop the countryside, the western part of Mongolia, with a view to, building a connection with Central Asia, and you mentioned corridor, right? And link to that corridor, right? And to help Mongolia to build a railway from the central part of Mongolia all the way to the west, to go through either through Xinjiang or through Russia to link to Kazakhstan railway network, right? And that was actually on the agenda of Mongolia, Mongolia's railway policy, right? That's the 3rd phase. I don't know when it's going to happen, but still, as long as they have that vision, then we should really revisit it, right? And see, what's possible there.
Thank you very much, Professor Bulag. Especially that suggestion that perhaps north-south connectivity in Mongolia has been developed to the detriment of center-west, and therefore Mongolia, Central Asia connectivity, and the last plan you mentioned, connecting through Xinjiang. This is something I bring up, and not to talk about myself, but I bring it up in the policy brief that you can access. And when I was writing this, I was worried that my suggestion was somewhat crazy, but I'm very happy to hear it from you. It gives it, I think, much more legitimacy. So now, perhaps if Mrs. Borodyna or Mr. Ville, do you have a reaction to this idea?
Thank you. And just a couple of points of reflection on the middle corridor. I mean, we take part in quite a lot of the events, engagements around the corridor. And unfortunately, Mongolia doesn't come up as a country that's connected to the corridor, which is a real shame because it's very close to Kazakhstan. And if China-Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railway does go through after a decade of discussions about it, there would be opportunities as well to link Mongolia to that and to facilitate trade. Whether that happens or not, and whose responsibility and who can push those engagements forward, and whether there is interest from Kazakh side as well to have those discussions, I don't know, but I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, because there is a big push on the middle corridor, not just on the infrastructure itself. A lot of the physical infrastructure for it is already in place, actually. It's the soft infrastructure, it's the regulatory standards side that needs improvement and where a lot of discussions will need to happen. And I suppose on the more sort of on a bigger point of why should we engage with Mongolia when there are so many issues and there are so many connectivity issues, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, connectivity issues exist everywhere. I mean, wherever you go, like wherever we want to find strategic raw materials to get them to EU or wherever we need them, we will need infrastructure. So I suppose we need to prioritize the countries where we do want to engage. And in the wider geostrategic context, now, abandoning or failure to engage with a country like Mongolia is actually a real gift to countries like Russia and China, because the reality is that Russia is also isolated on the international stage, and it isn't, because Putin is still visiting quite a lot of countries, not that many, but he's still traveling. People are still coming to Russia. He's not isolated. And the narrative that Russia is selling to the global south, I don't know if I can use that term, but to the non-aligned countries, is actually, it's receiving a warm welcome, because there is that feeling that we will not engage. We will come in for a couple of years and we will abandon our engagement. And I think that Mongolia shouldn't become the same story, because then you really do lose that battle of narratives with China and Russia. Same as in Africa, for example. China is there with FOCAC for the last couple of decades. An initiative from us can come and go, but China will be there and it will be back. And I think that it would be a real shame if that happened with Mongolia as well, because there is so much appetite for engagement. And so many regional governors, we had Governor Borma, I think from the west of Mongolia, joining our event. And she's very enthusiastic, she has a clear vision of what needs to happen for the region, a lot of international experience, and it would be a real shame to fail to engage those regional leaders who are emerging in the country.
Well, quite challenging, a lot to say, and I put down many things, but I think I'll try to keep it short. Yeah, first on the concentration of population in one capital. Mongolia is following the global trend, which is about urbanization. I mean, many people, let's say, perceive living in a city, a large city, even a very large city, as an opportunity for a better life than one can dream of if you stay on the countryside. And now here I'm not criticizing Mongolia. I'm just saying what is happening, the trend we see in Asia, we see it in Africa, we see it in Europe. I mean, this is patent, this is a trend. So probably, yes, we might try to correct that tendency through regional policies, with some success. But I mean, if we look at our own experience, and I'm not a regional policy specialist, but if you look at how it goes in Europe, well, we can claim that there are some successes, but I mean, still the trend goes into the direction of people moving to towns, let's say, or urban areas. First thing. Second, I mean, if we were to try, I mean, I'm just elaborating and thinking loud. If we were to try to keep people, let's say, having a decent life and having a life to go in a countryside, then they need to do something for making a living. I mean, it's it's an evidence, but this is how it goes. And probably this is where investing in forestry, agriculture related. It's not only about Kashmir. I mean, Kashmir is certainly something very, very valuable and that produces quite a sizable revenue for people, but still it has downsides because the numbers of running around Mongolia is certainly extremely high and has also a downside and an effect on the environment because they are eating all sorts of plants and well, the efforts to plant trees is also a bit of a consequences of not only the climate change but also the herding that is going around. So agriculture will certainly be one. And the other thing is you want to keep people that needs, I mean, young people wants to be connected. So I mean, digital is important. And this is where probably an answer in terms of connectivity, not only is about railways or roads, heavy infrastructures, but I mean, providing them access to the wider community and to the world, let's put it shortly, can be not only the opportunity to talk with your friends at the other end of the country or anywhere in the world, but also opportunities for business where you can, through digital platforms or businesses, develop something that makes you earn and be able to stay. I mean, we see this tendency in Europe where people want to go, some want to go into the town, but others want to leave the big centers like London, Paris, and other places because it's difficult, it's extremely expensive to live there. And after COVID, they've made experience of living on the countryside, which was much better, and they could still work on a remote way, meaning, why do I have to stay and be in the metro every day for an hour and a half, while I could have a nice, pleasant seaside view from my office? I mean, I'm a bit joking here, but this is something, and digital probably is one option in that case that can offer or give an opportunity and give an environment. Professor, on the traditional partners, certainly, I mean, I've mentioned numbers of countries. I'm sorry, I've perhaps forgotten some, but really, I mean, our interest as a EU is to invest on these traditional links and ties that existed during the previous period. And I fully agree. I mean, what has been done by these countries in the time is certainly recognized and helpful and needs to be continued. Why should it be stopped? I don't see why. I mean, there's no reason, on the contrary. So clearly what we offer, what the frame we offer under the Team Europe approach in the EU is a la carte, in the sense that everyone of the countries or member states who wants to join can join now. Czechs decide to, Hungarians decide not. This is how it goes. I cannot force everyone to go into, but I mean, there are opportunities for all to come and cooperate. Central Asia, yeah. I mean, as I said, I'm responsible for East Asia and the Pacific, and Mongolia is part of that conundrum, if I might say. Traditionally, and still some people believe that Mongolia belongs to Central Asia. And it used to be managed as a Central Asian country. Now, I'm no one to say whether it's right or wrong. I mean, I love to work on Mongolia, but I see let's say, the traditional links and the traditional approach and perception that Mongolia is a Central Asia or a Central Asian country, although it's difficult to say because perhaps it's not exactly how Mongolia perceives itself, how Central Asian perceive Mongolia. But you look as you said, when you look at a map, it makes a lot of sense. Of course, you need to see where the mountains and the reliefs of the geography lies. But I mean, it makes a lot of sense to see. But why is this country not connected with what is actually happening in the corridor discussion in Central Asia? It's on the way. So why not? I mean, because it's a bit more complex than just saying, okay, let's draw a line. Like if you look at subsea cables, this is something I do for the Pacific. Sometimes it's so easy to say, okay, let's draw a line from here to here, and then we'll have a cable. Well, yes, but no. At the end, it's more difficult because there are technical issues behind that. Sometimes you have to climb up mountains, or in deep sea you find things that you shouldn't face easily to lay down a cable. But yeah, this is clear and open discussion. I don't think we, as the European Union, we exclude it. Because we know it's close. It's very close to Kazakhstan. Still, there is a small bridge to pass, small bridge, which is either China or Russia. And there we might have some difficulty. Or said it needs to be approached. Sorry, I was extremely long again.
No, thank you very much. And it's good to hear, coming from institutions, this reflection that perhaps well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's perhaps a little bit of a gray zone in the EU's strategic vision, in the sense that it's not fully included in the Central Asian vision, and it's included in the Indo-Pacific vision, but not always. For example, the Indo-Pacific strategy, if I remember correctly, doesn't mention Mongolia. So perhaps some improvement could be made on that.
Yeah, on the Indo-Pacific, which is also one of my favorites. I mean, it depends who you speak to. It's a very fluid definition.
And now I hope you have your questions. Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really very enriching dialogue. Just to reflect on what I think should be one of the very important outcomes of today's meeting, because yeah, you all understood the narrative. Mongolia is a democratic free country with 2 neighbors, and 100% depend on the neighbors. 30 years ago, when we started this journey, we were 100% dependent on Russia. After 30 years of democratic development, we achieved the level that we are 100% dependent on Russia and China. And that is, I think, not a very wise narrative to continue. And here we see European Union should be a very important for our partners, more important than United States. Therefore, as Professor mentioned, why you don't invent new wheels, where already quarter of existing members of European Union have extensive experience working with Mongolia, like all the Eastern European countries. That's just one of the examples. But what we think today, this discussion should give an outcome is to really give the new narrative of the EU-Mongolia relations. Because everything we had until now, it was before Corona and before Ukraine war. And the result we have, Mongolia is 100% dependent on its neighbors. Because that was the policy which had laid into the European Union's policy, where Mongolia is still considered part of China. European Commission, Mongolia, there is a division which is responsible for Mongolia. It is China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Mongolia. And this shows, before the Ukraine war, that was their policy. And that was the deal. I don't know who made it. But now, wake-up call is there. Everything is clear. What to do? And I'm really glad that EU started this kind of big initiative, the Global Gateway, because China has started the Belt and Road. But after the Ukraine war, why we don't make it happen that it serves our goals, common values? Why make it the same way like China? Then why would we need it? But what we need is, it should be, we not need to shame our values. put them in front and say, now we make this Belt and Road initiative called Global Gateway for our values, kind of democratic Belt and Road initiative, where we pursue, because now we have seen, now all the different masquerade, is disappeared, We have seen how those countries with other values can handle its neighbors, Therefore, if this conference has to produce something, please give this wake-up call, See Mongolia now with different eyes after the Ukraine war, after the Corona, where for 2 years our southern borders were closed, and we nearly suffered the famine, And 101 countries have embassies in Beijing, responsible for Mongolia. And these countries' relations were closed for nearly 3 years, No ambassadors can come, nothing, happened. And can you imagine what would be the backlash, we have experienced during these times? That's a real wake-up call. If you really see that you need democratic, free countries with those values, then act, or it's going to be slip away, That's the reality, That's the reality. You could see it, And that's the reality we have to face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I think it's underwhelming to say now, please ask your questions after such powerful remarks, but maybe let's take 2, 3 at a time. If you can introduce yourself before posing them. I see you raise your hand first, and then Amanda. Is there someone else? The gentleman here. Okay, so please.
Thank you for the insights you shared. My name is Baldwin Burgess of UG Advisors. I'd like to continue on the topic of the diversification of the economy, which you also prominently write about in your paper, but I think it's also been aligned through your messages here. And I think one of the things when you want to achieve an economic diversification is you need to work on a financial services industry in the country. And a financial service industry is a bit like taking a blood test for a country. It's probably where you should start to see where the scalability of all initiatives are. For example, and also I guess it's a European area of excellence, and it's probably something that as Europeans we should also look into. Now, having done work in Mongolia with our project, we find that the sophistication of the financial service industry is at a very, let's say, low level right now. There is a lot of room for growth in this. We especially see this when we want to recommend certain investment innovations, and that the financial service industry is not really ready to know how to deal with those or how to market them. And especially we've noticed this in the insurance sector, which is also still not very sophisticated, and therefore an insurance sector creates institutional investors who in turn can support certain economic initiatives inside the country. So it's a mechanism that really is important. We've also noticed that, for example, we've also spoken about the development of infrastructure and urban development. And we've also noticed in our work that there seems to be a chicken and egg situation and everything that has to do with real estate. So you can't get financed unless you have a permit, and you get a permit when you actually have broken ground and actually advanced your construction quite a bit. So it seems to be stuck there as well. So I think the question I want to put on the table is I would like to have your reactions and your insights, and I'm especially directing this to INTPA because I know you look at these things, but how much is the development of the financial industry of importance in your policy recommendations? Also considering that there have been very successful case studies, 2 come to mind, such as Chile and South Korea. They focused on that and their economies have done quite fine. So I was just curious to see what your reaction to that would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Now, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you, Raúl. You mentioned Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. and I lead the EPC's work on Ukraine. So I couldn't resist asking a question. I mean, I can understand the difficult situation that your country is in, and obviously the whole of Central Asia, because all of those countries, along with your country, didn't go to the Global Peace Summit over the weekend. So that tells us something. But could you elaborate a bit on the impact that the full-scale invasion has had and the engagement that you have with Ukraine? I mean, the role that if you are playing some sort of silent role between Russia and Ukraine or other big powers. I mean, how are you engaging with President Zelensky, and what would be your advice to the West in terms of the strategy and the policies that they have? Perhaps against the backdrop of the conclusions that came from the summit. I'm sorry if that's a tricky question. Thank you.
Allow me to pick up one more question. Also gives you a little bit more time to answer. The gentleman over there had a question.
Okay, sorry. So my name is Raúl. So I have been working in Central Asia as an academician for almost 4 years. And previously I was staying in Europe, and I'm also doing some scientific consultations with different DGs in Brussels. Basically, I have especially experience with Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And I do find that Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan shares many, similarities with Mongolia. And also Kyrgyzstan and Mongolia, and we can see is the two of the only civil societies, or maybe we say half civil societies in this region. So it is actually very valuable, for European Union, I think, to continually to support the civil societies, also the economic diversifications, for Mongolia. So currently the framework is limited, as Monsieur Ville mentioned, that Mongolia is under the section of Eastern Asia and South Asia, not in the Central Asia. But however, I remember that 2 months ago, or maybe 1.5 months ago, Mr. Cameron from the UK, so within 1 week, he visited both 5 Central Asian countries plus Mongolia. Yes, so this could be, I guess, offer some insightful message. So I personally, I'm not very sure, but if the European Union plus C5 initiative right now might also find some flexible solutions to engage with Mongolia, I'm not very sure, but this is one of a scenario. I guess it might be, promote the bilateral relations of both regions and the sustainable development of both Europe and the Central Asia and Mongolia regions. So this is my humble, naive thinking. But however, I have a question with Mr. Ambassador. So how do you perceive Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan from your perspective? Would you like to share some of your opinions? And how do you think that Europe might be able to support the collaboration between Mongolia and Central Asian countries in economic collaboration, also fight against climate change? Because both Mongolia and Central Asia are actually under very serious threat of the climate change at this moment. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's turn to the ambassador, perhaps, for the 2 questions, Ukraine and Central Asia.
Yeah, because that was also one topic I wanted to reflect. Because you see Mongolia on the 2 neighbors, and it's, I think, the only country in the world which has no regions. Any country of the world have regions, but for Mongolia, we cannot be region with China, we cannot be region with Russia, and there is no other. But there is only one option, as Professor mentioned, very close to us geographically, also a little bit 20-30 kilometers Russia, also some China, but historically and culturally, religiously, in many ways, our closest region could be Central Asia. Because today, Mongolia is expanding its policy towards Central Asia. We opened just now the latest embassy in Uzbekistan, we have in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So there's some weird unilaterally opening embassies. It means here we see some very important future policy. And I hope that because Europe developed a new policy for Central Asia, introduced the summit. Last year there was the foreign minister level, now the planning the head of state. So, but Mongolia is falling out of this game, and that is something which we really see as a big backlash for us. And I hope the European Union can, with the new commission and after the elections, new parliament could address this issue and then make some policy with regard to Central Asia and Mongolia, which is eminent and very important. Also, Mongolia could be very beneficial for Central Asian countries because they all want to pursue the same way of opening and democratization. And here, they cannot follow example of France or Germany, but Mongolia's example is for them like a playbook. They should see all the advantages and all the disadvantages and lessons and so on, like Thailand, Myanmar, and so on. Kyrgyzstan, they have already studied very carefully and take over also some of many of our experiences. That's something where Mongolia could be also some kind of role model. And then, of course, Ukraine. From the beginning, Mongolia provided some financial assistance, and president on the presidential and ministerial level, there has been telephone conversations in the past. But at the same time, of course, just after the war started, of course, in the international organizations, we had to pursue the not maintaining the balance. Therefore, we are abstaining in most of the decisions. And just when we had encountered some measures like cutting the fuel supply and so on, which would really affect babies' lives in Mongolia. This is our life is dependent, where we cannot have really no enemies in the world. Therefore, like we cooperate with both Koreas, South and North, we are an open dialogue with all our neighbors and also beyond. Therefore, that's the policy we would continue. But at the same time, as I told, this is an awakening call, and it's now Mongolia has absolutely no illusions, because when during these past years, if you carefully listen to the announcements of some leadership in Russia accusing Mongolia hosting some biological weapon laboratories against Russia and so on. So there's been real threatening situations where we really revealed and trying to explain that that's nothing such kind of impossible to implement in Mongolia, where we would threaten our neighbors. Therefore, it is something where we really need to be on high alert and make sure that our third neighbor policy works and works in the right way from now on. That is something.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Do any of the panelists want to come into any of these two issues? Or if not, we can turn to, yes, Professor.
I think your point about narrative is really important, and we should really sort of tell a good story about the relationship between Mongolia and EU, and also relationship between Mongolia and Central Asia. Right? It seems that we have a misunderstanding, and that's of course natural because we haven't really come up with a good narrative. Right? Now, a narrative is emerging now, especially with regard to the relationship between Central Asia and Mongolia, because Mongolia today And I don't know whether you've been to Mongolia recently, but on this August, there's going to be a huge festival called International Nomadic Cultural Festival. Okay. That is, I think this year's festival is the third, third one. But then the question is, why do Mongolians sort of, embrace nomadism, right? In fact, this is actually a response to Kyrgyzstan's World Nomadic Sports Initiative they did back in 2016, around that time, right? Right. So in other words, Central Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, these two countries are now embracing nomadic, ideas, right? And they are packaging themselves, their culture, in nomadic frames. And recently, just in this past March, Tokayev, Kazakh president, actually claimed that Kazakhstan is a direct descendant or successor to the Golden Horde, right? What does that mean? That means that they're saying they are the descendants of Chinggis Khan's oldest son. But who are we in Mongolia? I'm from Inner Mongolia, and who are we? We would say we are the descendant of his youngest son, right? Toloi and Toloi's descendant Kublai Khan, and we have Yuan, and they have the Golden Horde, right? So in other words, we actually now converge historically that we all make claim to one heritage, one history, that is the Mongol Empire. So what does Mongol Empire mean to us? It actually means as something like Roman Empire to European countries. In other words, it becomes a common heritage to all these countries, and then it means that we need to share this heritage rather than try to monopolize it. And it seems that we are now slowly coming to terms with each other, and they are sending representatives to Mongolia, and Mongolian sending representatives to those countries, those events. And what's also interesting is that last year, former Secretary-General of UN, Ban Ki-moon, right, he and I think Stanford University organized something called Trans-Altai Initiative, and in Mongolia, and hosted by the Mongolian government, by the Speaker of the House, right, and this year, this April, they did another event, basically encouraging using an Altai framework to transcend the differences, right? So we're Mongolian, they are the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, okay? So, but what's really the link? The link is from his perspective, Ban Ki-moon's perspective, and who is Korean, and behind him there are Japanese. Basically, Japanese and Koreans, they embrace Altai identity, right, to transcend Chinese identity, because they have historically been linked to China. So their concern is how to build an alternative identity. So they have come up with this idea, Altai. And with Altai, of course, and this is linguistic category, Japanese, Korean, Manchu, Mongolian, Turkic languages, they can all belong to one family, right? Altai family. So in other words, there is a movement going on already, right? And that is Altai, rather than Central Asia. So in other words, you are saying that Mongolia doesn't have a region now, right? We need to find a region, but there is a new region, a conceptual region emerging, a cultural region emerging, that is Altai, and that's very important. So that we need to really monitor this sort of movement. It's just emerging, and see whether there is a potential to build a better narrative, right? Now, coming to the relationship between EU and Mongolia, well, we all know that ex-member of EU, Britain, was really important in forging the relationship between Europe and Mongolia, because after all, Churchill was one of the three bigs, right, who helped Mongolia to get independence from China at the Yalta conference, right? And UK was also the first Western country to recognize Mongolia's independence in and establishing diplomatic relations in 1963, and immediately after UK recognition, France and most European countries recognized Mongolia's independence. So Mongolia really recognized the importance of EU, and EU is indispensable in the imagination of Mongolia as a lot of things, independence, sovereignty, and everything, right? And in addition to Western Europe, of course, as I mentioned, even the Central and Eastern European countries back in the Soviet time, right? They were also so helpful and instrumental in helping Mongolia to lessen their independence on the Soviet Union and China. So these stories need to be brought back, right? To tell a story, to a narrative, right? And without this narrative, we seem to have no direction where we're going. In other words, there are doubts why should we help Mongolia? What's the point, right? But with this narrative, I think this narrative will help us, right? At least to reorient our thinking and explain, why we are doing all these things.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very important to take those things into account as well. And now if I may turn to Mr. Ville for the question on the financial services.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Perhaps before I say anything on this, look, I mean, administrative division within the EU institution, be it EAS or the Commission, is a way to organize work more than, of course, it might be perceived with a symbolic dimension. I don't disagree, but be reassured. I mean, I'm talking almost twice, if not 3 times a day, with my colleagues in charge of Central Asia. So it's not that we are in 2 different worlds. Yes, East Asia is an entity where there is a very large country, as you can imagine, but it's not only that one. It is encompassed in it. Of course, Mongolia is part of that, but there's Japan, Korea as well. So it's a very different world to what we usually have as group of countries, and it's clearly not homogeneous, because the relation with one and the others are really organized completely differently. This said, I mean, in our reflections, when we speak about digital, when we speak about satellites, when we speak about transport, I mean, clearly Mongolia is part of that discussion. It's not, we cannot decide for Mongolia and for Central Asia countries. Of course, this is their choice. But I mean, the way we try to frame our reflections internally, we keep we keep, let's say, a broader view which goes beyond the single countries. And I agree with the ambassador. I mean, Mongolia has no region to back up on, because it's a bit isolated. By default, I'd say it was considered to be Central Asia, as said by default, which is not a good answer, but it shows how it is. But it goes also beyond that. Now, back to the financial services. I think it's a quite relevant point. The thing is, how do we do that? Because we spoke a lot about infrastructure, investments, heavy things. We speak about, I mean, railroads and satellites. Additionally, I mean, financial services is perhaps something which is, sorry, I should get closer. So I want to turn to you, but I mean, I'm forced to look at the other end. Sorry. So, yes, I think in terms of development, this is certainly an avenue where private sector would be certainly encouraged to go, and with all the virtuous circle that it would create would certainly make sense. Long, but still a way where you don't necessarily need a lot of outside investment on to bring heavy things to I mean, materially speaking, to the country. But of course, it relies basically on the legislation of the country to be adopted. Of course, training, and that perhaps we can help in the sense of providing TVET sort of support. So I would say, not a problem to perceive it. I'm trying to frame it in the things we do. It's part of the enabling environment in a way or another.
You see it as a horizontal.
Yeah, more than specifically go into that specific area. not to say this is not a string. I mean, we do have, when we speak about financial services, most of the time we look at the let's say the negative side of it, where I'm dealing with it. I mean, I already said 3 times, but I'm also having the relation with the small island countries, which are some of them on blacklists for money laundering and sort of things, because they've set up business models and activities and industries to make a living in the countries. When you're a small, tiny island in the middle of nowhere, well, you don't have that many possibilities. One of the options was to develop financial centers with extremely attractive rules for some sort of financial services. Fair enough. Now, these rules now are challenged not only by us, but in the international community to say, well, it's too loose for money laundering. So we are coming on the wrong end. Say you have a case, and we try to say, no, look, it's not fit for purpose because, voilà. Now, I don't know, honestly, Mongolia is not part of that, as far as I know. But I mean, not yet. But I mean, probably would be something that we can provide support to how to build a legislation on financial services that would be promoting or developing the industry, or providing the environment for developing the industry, and perhaps TVET would be an add-on on this. This is very personal thinking on it, but this is. But I do agree that would be certainly an opportunity to develop.
Forget where the emancipate the national capital for the private sector.
Exactly.
The global gateway.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, we have about 6-7 minutes left. Perhaps we can take 1 or 2 questions, very quick ones, very concise, with very concise answers from the panel, if there are any questions. No questions? Oh, someone else who hasn't asked anything, perhaps? Is that a hand? Or is that no? Okay, well, please.
Sorry. Monsieur Jean-Louis Ville, regarding to the financial infrastructures, actually, and I have observed that the regional finance center in Central Asia right now is Astana and Almaty. And in some other countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, actually there is, and find what I have observed, there is a shortage of investments to support different initiatives. So, so I heard that the EIB is going to set up an office in Tashkent, but I'm not sure whether it has happened or not, and I'm not sure when it will finally happen. So here, regarding to this seminar, so my question is that, yes, I mean, to cultivate the financial system in Central Asia. I mean, for example, they have banking schools before, but dating back from 1930s or 1940s in Tashkent, in Bishkek, in Astana, in Almaty. So the financial education in Central Asia actually is not fully converged with the global standards. I'm not sure what is the situation in Mongolia, but my question is that, so what is, for example, EU's strategy to support, I mean, cultivation of the, let's say, sustainable financing system, maybe in Central Asia and well in Mongolia. And if we think about the green financing, what I mean that, as what Ambassador mentioned, the green finance scheme towards Central Asia might also include Mongolia, maybe also include Azerbaijan, what I think. So I just would like to you to make some comments and to share with some, future initiatives from the European Commission.
Thank you very much. I'll invite Mr. Ville to answer, and the other panelists, if they have any concluding thoughts or something that they feel was left out, please, you can comment that on succession. Thank you.
Thank you. So short answers. We all wait for the EIB office to be opened. So we definitely think this is absolutely a need for the region. Now, you know that the president of the EIB has changed, so I suppose it's been a bit delayed for that reason, because she's not taking, I mean, she has been taking office recently, and she wants to review. I cannot speak on behalf of the EIB. I mean, I'm on the same position as yours on this one, and it would definitely help. I mean, I see that from other regions. On the financial culture, well, I think, as I said, TVET could be probably something we could promote. So to be seen, there are many ways. I would personally see it more as a business schools case, like one of the many London-based or European-based, Frankfurt, Paris, Milan. You take whoever you want. Business schools on finance could also, I mean, be associated with that, but I think it would be their own initiative. I mean, I can probably not call HEC or Bocconi or whoever in Germany or in London to say, I want you to go to Barrera or Central Asia at large and set up a business school with a specialty on finance. I mean, this is clearly beyond what I can do. On the green financing, yes. I mean, we have some initiatives through the FSD Plus. So I'm sorry, it's going to be technical because I want to be short. But you heard about the FSD Plus, which is the instrument de-risking some of the funding we provide, or providing a guarantee for banks, including EIB. We have under this one one guarantee or one package that we want to offer on green bonds, and this is probably something that is, but it's more, let's say, sovereign. It's not private sector, at least at the start, where we would offer support and guarantee and de-risking for issuing for countries to issue green bonds, meaning with requiremements to invest in green. In green capacities, not only renewable, but I mean all sorts of investments that are say compatible with the taxonomy and are climate friendly. To make it, sorry, very short. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, perhaps Mrs. Borodyna.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of very short reflections on the green finance, and I think the finance culture. I'm not a finance sector specialist, but we have engaged quite a lot in terms of energy transition in the region, and I think that there are some political realities and political economy realities that the countries would need to deal with to attract further green finance. And because the reality is they are fossil fuel based, and there is quite a lot of investment going into that, and it's quite difficult to attract that financing if that's the direction in which you're going. And I think another quick reflection on what the ambassador was saying on Russia accusing Mongolia of hosting biological weapons. And I'm Ukrainian by background, and I like to indulge in watching some Russian TV just so I can understand what perception of reality is being broadcast. And I think that the threats towards the neighborhood, whether it's Mongolia, Kazakhstan, are quite a staple on Russian television. It's perhaps, you know, the senior leadership is a little bit more restrained, but, you know, the threat to invade Kazakhstan and take over North Kazakhstan, I mean, we've been hearing that from Russian nationalists for a long time. So I think it's a sign for the EU for an opportunity not to be missed to engage in the region, because the invasion of Ukraine has really hit it hard. That's the policy that Russia can pursue in relation to its neighbors.
Thank you very much. Professor Bulag, do you have any final thoughts?
Right, just very briefly, I think we all know Mongolia is, of course, a democracy, but it is a special kind of democracy, I would say. And as I said, you know, democracy is a way of life. It is not an ideology. That's something that I really want to emphasize. And I also want to point out that Mongolia has another aspiration in terms of how to position itself in the national system. Mongolia wants to be a neutral country. The role model for Mongolia is not, you know, America or Japan or EU. It is actually Switzerland. Mongolia wants to be another Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is democracy, right? But once you become a neutral country, then it is spared of all the awkward questions, whether you support this or support that, right? What's your position? Why do you do this? Why do you don't do that, right? But at the same time, of course, as a neutral country, it should have certain responsibility. And I think I can't speak for Mongolia because I'm not a Mongolian from Mongolia, from the other side. But as an academic, I can vouch saying that Mongolia has been helpful to a lot of people who suffered in the war. In other words, Mongolia actually provided sanctuary to over 10,000 young men and women, especially men from Buryatia, from Tuva, even the Russians, who actually fled Putin's drafting of an army. So Mongolia has been really helpful, and that's been appreciated.
Thank you very much. Perhaps if the ambassador very quickly, you would like to.
Just the response for these financial services. Yeah, we have just recently introduced a new airport, and now there's a plan to build the airport city, and there are also big plans to establish a Mongolia International Finance Center based on that city. So I think that could be a very important international finance hub, possibly because of the nature of Mongolia as a free and a country with the rule of law, and that's something you should bear in mind. Maybe upcoming some projects. And secondly, just announcement next Friday, not this week, next week Friday, there is the 8 parliamentary elections, free parliamentary elections happening in Mongolia. Please, since you all now Mongolia experts, please follow it. And that will be very crucial elections, because after 30 years, we had a new constitutional reform, and that will be the first elections with the constitutional reform, which is aimed at the regional policy. So before, always our members of parliament were from provinces. And this time, Mongolia was divided into 5 regions. And now all the parliament members, majority of them will be elected from the regions on the list, party list, the list of candidates. It means it's a very new experience, and that will also change Mongolia's future toward the provincial, regional development. And a lot of new things will come out in a policy-wise. Therefore, please be aware and then follow Mongolia's elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you to the panelists. And
my name is Svetlana Taran. I'm also from Ukraine, and I'm a research fellow here at the EPC. And I just wanted to say that, yeah, we understand that your situation and neutral position, and it's up to the country, to the sovereign country to choose its position and foreign policy, and we respect this. But on the other hand, I was thinking how actually important the situation in Ukraine, and how the world will end in Ukraine, even for Mongolia and for such countries as Mongolia and for Central Asian countries that are actually experiencing very much the same situation and same threats as Ukraine. So yeah, we respect, but we do hope for international cooperation and partnership, also with Mongolian partners. But also, I would like to maybe from our experience, Ukraine's experience, we used to be also very dependent on Russia, and economically and military and in socially and in many areas, but we had, and our way to independence started with actually when we wanted to sign a trade agreement with the European Union, yes, and wanted to be to form trade relations, so to be more diversified, less dependent on Russia. And this is so the first was trade wars, and then other wars happened. So yes, it's very important to try to be as diversified as possible, let us say, and this way, and also to form as many partnerships with different with the EU. Yes, it's the main partner, but also with as many as possible to be as it's
Thank
the
you.
only way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to the ambassador, to the panelists for coming all the way from London, Cambridge, from INPA. It's also a walk. Thank you to all of you for being here on a Monday afternoon, and I wish you a very good week. Thank you. Bye-bye.